This comes so naturally.
All right, welcome. It's my pleasure as the chair of the Committee on Diversity and as also a faculty with the Mental Health Concentration Focus Area. We have a great speaker today who's going to talk about the Hmong's changed lifestyles and health issues in the last 50 years. Dr. Yang Sao Xiong is a professor here with a joint appointment in the School of Social Work as well as Asian American Studies. He's also a recipient of the Anna Julia Cooper Fellowship. We're very excited to have him with us in a lot of different ways, so looking forward to hear what he has to say today. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. Well, thank you so much for coming. Like I told Nick, I love it when it's more informal discussion and engaging stuff, but as I was planning this presentation, I got too excited, so it's now becoming more of a longer presentation that I originally had planned, but it's adapted from another presentation I gave recently at a UW Health System Symposium organized by the National Kidney Foundation, who had asked me to go and present on Hmong and talk about their health issues, and so this is adapted from that presentation. So I will talk a little bit about their lifestyle changes. Most of you, I'm sure, or all of you, are familiar with Hmong and some of their changes already in the past couple of years. We'll also talk about Hmong's health problems and changes over time, and then maybe look at some notions or conceptions of Hmong that may be unfounded, So in my mind, my audience was really graduate students and undergrad students, so forgive me. So how do we as social workers work with Hmong immigrant communities in such a way that we could provide culturally competent services and care to this population? So I'll give you a brief background of their migrations, and then we'll talk about their lifestyle in Laos. It's also, as we work with families, it's also important to understand their social structure. And then it's also important to understand their experiences with war and the mass displacements that occur in the 1970s. And then we'll jump to the US context and look at initially how they were received, and then really focus on, in the bulk of the time, on health issues and some challenges to health access, because that's part of my research area and research interest here. So let's start with historical migrations. As some of you may know, Hmong are an ethnic group in Laos. So the vast majority of Hmong in the US were from either Laos or Thailand. And they started migrating from southern China to Indochina. Then it was pre-Indochina. In about the mid-1800s, that's as far as written records show us, that between about 1847 and 1850, the first documented migrations of Hmong moved from southern China to Indochina. Laos now is the size of Michigan. Laos is 91,000 square miles, Michigan is 96,000. So tiny. And Laos does not have a very big population either. Way back in the 1800s, we probably had less than 1 million. Currently, we have about 6 million people in Laos. So that's a map by another anthropologist who's done research for the last 40 years on Hmong. And that's, as far as we know, a map of where Hmong are concentrated in Southeast Asia and areas of southeastern China. So I drew some lines there to indicate the path of their migration. So since the mid-1800s, then Hmong migrated down south, and they first came through Vietnam. Many of them, in fact, stayed in Vietnam, and then some trickled down to Laos, but they never went very far south. And so many of them stayed on the eastern side of Laos, central part. Some made it across to Thailand, And probably because there's a huge Mekong River separating Laos and Thailand, that's maybe one of the physical obstacles to them coming to Thailand. A few went to Burma or Myanmar. So Hmong and Mien constitute only about 2% of the Laotian population about 100 years ago. Then in the 1940s, they increased and they made up about 4 to 5% of the population. By 2005, Hmong constituted about 8% of the Laotian population. And even within the small country of Laos, there are various ethnic groups within Laos. So Hmong are the third largest of about 49 different ethnic groups in Laos. Lao are the dominant ethnic group, followed by Khmu, the second largest ethnic group, and Hmong. We're going to switch gears a little and then talk about their lifestyle in Laos. So Laos, has anybody been to Laos or Thailand, that area of the world? Okay. Has a pretty dry winters and humid summers, high humidity, high rainfall. Sounds like Wisconsin, but it's different in the sense that there's no snow. Even in the high elevations, we hardly see any snow. Hmong live in small villages up in the higher elevations where the air is cooler. It's about 4 to 10 families to a village, so very low. We're talking about very low population density here. That's 2 images. See any similarities or contrasts? So certainly, right? But in Laos, certainly, it's a lot greener, at least. And it's kind of ironic that within the U.S. context, it is usually the wealthy who live on the way up there in the mountains, who enjoy certain things up there. But in underdeveloped countries, it was the poor or working class who live in the mountains. So in Laos, as well as in Thailand, since the mid-1800s through to the present day, many Hmong practiced slash and burn farming, and they had long work hours. So rather than working from 8 to 5 or 7 to 5, they worked from 5 to 10, doing manual crop planting and harvesting, walking daily from fields, harvesting, hunting, fishing, gathering firewood. They also live on a very healthy diet. When you talk to elders, they would say, and of course this may be a little exaggeration, but 99% of the time they consume vegetables or grains, or it may not be an exaggeration. So these included mustard greens, rice, cucumbers, bitter melons, beans, yams, chili peppers, papaya, bamboo shoots, corn, sugar canes. Sounds just like the farmer's market here too. 1% of their diet consists of other kinds of meat. So at that time, because they had little access to other types of food products like oil, sugar, and salt, it meant that they also consumed very little of these. So the basic lifestyle of Hmong in Laos was consisted of high daily exercise activities, especially as they farm and take care of the young and gather food and supplies. They also consume high amounts of vegetables and grains, fruits. Plus, they also had moderate weather conditions. They were, at that time, exposed they had little exposure to pollutants, household chemicals. But life was about to change between the 1940s and 1970s. But at least initially, there were periods of peace. And because they live up there in the mountains, they were somewhat isolated, but also they could be free from some of the stresses of urban life. which equates to a relatively healthy lifestyle, I think, during that time. So they did, of course, face other health issues that people all around the world in underdeveloped countries face, like high infant mortality, malnutrition, unsafe water, that often led to maybe diarrhea, malaria. But these were issues that underdeveloped countries face. Now, let's talk a little bit about Hmong social structure so that we can better understand what the community consists of, or at least how Hmong see their social relations to be. So I outline here, starting from the clan, we have clans, and clan is this very broad idea, almost as broad as an ethnic group, and several subclans make up a clan, several lineages make up a subclan, several families make up the lineage, and several persons usually make up the family or household. So how many clans are there? Well, it depends on who you ask, but usually there are about anywhere from 12 to 21 clans that researchers have found. One anthropologist have actually documented about 32 possible clans. In the US, they're usually the name for them is the 18 clans, but the reality is that in most communities, there are about 10 to 12 clans together. Now, clan is an important thing for Hmong because clans interact through marriages, for example, and person of the same clan name cannot marry each other, and so they marry outside of the clan. So a Xiong, for example, would not be able to marry another member of the Xiong clan because they regard each other as brothers and sisters. Now, it's also important that within Hmong society, we have very precise kinship terms to refer to each other. So rather than the what they see as the more generic uncles and aunts in the English or Western world, Hmong have what's called much more precise terms. So, for example, to refer to one's the older brother of one's father, we use the word zihla, and the younger brother of one's father is referred to as zinza. The brother of one's mother is dalo, and the husband of one's aunt yilo. So all of these are very precise kinship terms that Hmong use on a daily basis to acknowledge their relationships to each other. It also implies some status differences, but more importantly, it refers to how they are located within the social structure and through what kinds of marriage ties they are related. So that's kind of a visual representation of Hmong society, with the outermost circle representing Hmong society, and as you get closer inside, you have the clan. And keep in mind, I said the clan is this very broad concept. Within Hmong society, of course, there's not just one clan, but multiple clans. And then you have the subclan, followed by ritual lineages. I call them ritual lineages, and others too, because members of the same lineages practice certain rituals that are similar compared to people outside of the lineage. And that diagram up there is a visual representation of a typical Hmong American community. These clans, lineages, and families are related through marriages. So the arrows there, for example, may show one household, or one household related to another of a different clan who live in the same community, for example. So because there's this structure of clans and lineages, there's this notion out there that sometimes Western societies make decisions individually, whereas Eastern cultures make these decisions more collectively. And I want to say that's in fact a kind of a false dichotomy, because in fact, depending on situation, things can be Hmong too. Hmong, like anybody else, can make very individualistic decisions, or sometimes they consult with the family, their friends, their networks, and that too can be a collective decision, but it depends. Let's talk a little bit about how they got here, how Hmong got to the US. Well, going backwards a little, during the mid-1940s and 50s, Hmong were engaged in what's called the First Indochina War. In that war, it was French colonial authorities against the Vietnamese who wanted independence. Hmong segments of Hmong society were on both sides, and some were trying to stay neutral. So we can't begin to think of Hmong as just simply on one side or the other, but as entangled in multiple, on multiple sides. And then between the 1960s and 1975, Hmong were involved in what's known as the secret war in Laos. Secret because Laos was supposed to be a neutral country during that time, given the Geneva Accords of 1962. However, the U.S. and other countries, because of their involvement in the Vietnam War, built military bases in Laos, and Hmong, specifically Hmong, were recruited for that war. Now, there's also some assumptions out there, or the myth that Hmong were recruited because they were warrior-like, fierce soldiers, more fierce than any other group. However, through my research and actually reading through declassified documents, we find a very different set of reasons for why Hmong were recruited to side into the war. And some of the reasons included, and this was coming directly from U.S. officials, the perception that Hmong were far removed from the centers of political power in Laos, the perception that Hmong did not necessarily get along with the dominant Lao ethnic group in Laos, and third, and perhaps most importantly, that the U.S. saw Hmong as a commandable, controllable group. And so it was convenient then to recruit Hmong into the war. The war, of course, in addition to causing massive destruction to lives, about 10% of the Hmong population perished during the war. So 10% of the U.S. population is the equivalent of about 30 million or so, wipe out as a result of Hmong's involvement in the war. Now, once again here, segments of Hmong society, perhaps the majority segment sided with the U.S., but a major segment also sided with the communist side. And those who try to stay neutral face repercussions from both sides. So in terms of health, I think most of the Hmong, through the war, they became exposed to various chemicals and diseases. Of course, the war caused not just physical destruction, but it also led to a lot of psychological trauma. It exposed many of the men who were fighting as soldiers to cigarettes. Now, of course, before that time, some Hmong men were using some forms of tobacco, but it wasn't widespread. So through that war, Hmong men especially became exposed to cigarettes as well as chemicals and other diseases that they previously were not exposed to. And the war then, after 1975, caused massive displacements of Indochinese refugees. So starting in about 1975, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Indochinese became refugees. Thailand absorbed many of the refugees. Eventually, over 2 million people would become refugees in Thailand. But between about 1970s and the late 80s, about 1.3 million of these refugees, of Southeast Asian refugees, went to Thailand. And of these 1.3 million, about 228,000 were Laotian refugees. This included 100,000 Hmong refugees. Now, Hmong and other Laotian refugees stayed in the Thailand refugee camps, not just for a year or two, perhaps most of them stayed for several years, and many stayed for decades until they were admitted to the U.S. My family, for example, lived in the Thailand camps between 1975 and 1987 for a period of about 12 years. We were also in this camp called Ban Vinai, and at some point Ban Vinai was home to about 45 to 50,000 refugees altogether. Now imagine being in an area of less than a square mile wide, and you have literally tens of thousands of people together in the camps. So this image here shows possibly, it may be Ban Vinai, I'm not sure, but it's certainly one of the refugee camps in Thailand. These are Hmong refugees. It gives you an image of what life was like. So besides being very crowded, there were a lot of restrictions. In the camps, you couldn't go outside. You had to ask for papers in order to even walk outside or visit other camps, and very few people could go outside of the Barvara camps. They receive ration food, rice, salted foods, canned foods, processed food, some vegetables. They consume about the same types of meat, pork, chicken, beef. There was beginning at that time an increase in substance use especially among men. So that included the use of various prescribed and non-prescribed drugs. Tobacco use was common among some veterans. Opium usage increased. And alcohol consumption too increased because of I think in part because of the sedentary lifestyle. They couldn't go out. Everybody was inside camps doing not much other than socializing, trying to survive in the camps. So population density alone, is it good for mental health? In some ways it may be. People who were traumatized by the war were looking for communities, were looking to have each other. That's all they have left, and that may be good for mental health in some sense. But it could also have very negative consequences for physical health. In the camps, Hmong encountered a whole range of different health issues. Besides physical and psychological trauma, there was, of course, a lot of stress and fear, especially of being forcibly repatriated back to Laos. It was the fear of coming to the U.S. to what's unknown to them. There was a fear of leaving family behind. There's also the issue of chronic malnutrition that Hmong refugees and other refugees encountered. They were exposed to infectious and parasitic diseases. They faced respiratory diseases. They had anemia. But that was life in the camp. And things were about to even change more drastically as they became resettled in the U.S. So let me present some figures. Before I do that, let me talk a little bit about their initial context of reception so we get a sense of how they were received, where they were located, and what types of resources they came with. So when Hmong refugees came, unlike other economic immigrants, there were no existing co-ethnic communities to receive them. That meant that they lacked co-ethnic support, which is extremely important for immigrant groups. Yes?
I'm not sure I understand what co-ethnic means.
Co-ethnic simply just means other Hmong communities or other Asian. Thank you for that question. And so they ended up, depending on who resettled them, and many Hmong families were resettled by church organizations and by private families. And so they ended up in very random places. And this is made worse by the U.S. policy of deliberately distributing them across different cities and states in order so that they would not overburden any local community in terms of their social services or health services. And so Southeast Asian refugees during the late 1970s and 80s were found in cities like Philadelphia, Des Moines, Seattle, and very random places. In some places, they face racial prejudice and violence. And it's important to keep in mind that these were not necessarily just all white residents who were discriminating them or inflicting violence on them. Hmong, like other Indo-Chinese of that time, faced a bifurcated labor market. That is, they faced an hourglass-shaped labor market in which they had to compete with the masses, or the majority down here on the bottom, who had lower formal education and credentials. And they weren't able to compete with the people up there at the higher rung of the ladder because they lacked formal education credentials. So they face issues of joblessness in their communities. All of this translates to a situation in which Hmong became, of that time, one of the poorest, at least economically, groups in U.S. society. So Hmong refugees, along with Laotian refugees and Cambodians, became some of the poorest groups during that time. This is some figures on their population. So based on the latest census count, we know that there's at least 250,000, and that's, as in other groups, most likely an undercount of Hmong. And the real count may be something more than 350,000, we think. Most Hmong are concentrated in just a couple of states, California being the first state, Minnesota. Wisconsin is the state with the third largest Hmong. What's unique about the Midwest is that in both Minnesota and Wisconsin, Hmong are the largest Asian American group. And in California, even though in absolute numbers, Hmong make up a pretty big population, they make up only a very tiny proportion of the Asian American population. Wisconsin is followed by North Carolina, and that's followed by Michigan. So the Hmong population is a relatively young population with an average age of about 23 years. And about 45% are under 18 years old. So many of these services have been targeted, even though some of the services are targeted towards the elders and the young, elders and the seniors, we're missing a whole chunk of the population in terms of who need services. And the young, in many cases, are not receiving services to the extent that they should be. That's another chart showing their English speaking ability from 1990 through to the present. In 1990, for example, about 76% reported on the census state questionnaire that they spoke English less than very well. Now, this declined over time. In the 2006 and 2010 American Community Survey, we found that the majority, about 58%, spoke English at home or spoke English very well. And a minority, 42%, spoke English less than very well. But still, compared to Asian Americans and compared to the entire U.S. population, what the data suggests is that Hmong still have a long ways to go in terms of acquiring English ability. Hmong, like other relatively recent immigrant groups, also have a low average educational attainment. Among Hmong 25 years old and over, female, only about 15% of Hmong females have attained BA degrees or higher, compared to the U.S. average, which was 28% in 2010. 14% of Hmong males have obtained BA degrees or higher, compared to the average U.S. population of 29%. So in summary, you have a population with relatively low English ability, relatively low average educational attainment, combined with relatively high poverty rates, although even though poverty has been improving over the years, the decades. Now, specifically in Wisconsin, they're concentrated in a couple of cities. So in Milwaukee, we counted in the census data about 10,000, followed by Wausau, Sheboygan with 3,700. And if we count just the city of Madison, there are about 2,700, but if we include the larger Madison metro area, we actually have over 4,000. So sometimes when we work with diverse social work communities, it's important to keep some things in mind that it's not helpful to assume they're a monolithic group. It's not helpful to have preconceptions of who they are until we really understand that within any group there could be an immense within group differences. So there are differences with respect to resources, for example. People within the Hmong community don't all have the same types of English or native language skills. They have different levels of educational attainment, income, occupation. But there's also within group differences in terms of where they're located. So, and where they're located may be determined by the year that they arrive, where they resettle. Midwest, as I alluded to earlier, the Midwest may be a little bit different than the Western coast. Hmong being the largest Asian group here, they may be more visible. They may have certain privileges that Hmong in California does not have, or they may lack certain privileges given that they are seen as another Asian American group, but the Asian Americans here in the Midwest actually don't make up a whole lot of the population. And so in California, for example, given that the Asian Americans there make up about close to 5-6% or more of the population in certain cities, they may have very different experiences from the Hmong here in the Midwest. There's also differences in terms of social norms and preferences. There are generational differences. You have what in sociology we've identified as the first, second, 1.5, and third generations of Hmong. Within the Hmong community, there are also differences with respect to religious beliefs and affiliations. So over time, many Hmong have also adopted new religions, and so besides traditional religion, they've adopted Christianity, for example, Buddhism, and other religions. Not all Hmong self-identify as Hmong. Many of them may identify as something else. They may associate with different groups in the community rather than just Hmong organizations, for example. So let's switch gears a little and talk about the health issues since resettlement. Now, in the late 1970s and 80s, Hmong encountered this mysterious condition called sudden unexpected death syndrome, and it inflicted usually men between the ages of 30 to 40s. It was during that age gap. They would just go to sleep and not wake up, and with no unknown previous medical conditions. During that time, Hmong men and women also suffer from stress and PTSD. But over time, it seems as if the sudden unexpected death syndrome went away, at least for the time being. And Hmong, since the 1980s, have come to encounter a whole range of other types of health issues and problems, from sleep disorders to gout and kidney stones. And usually these conditions occur together. So rather than having just gout, a person may have both gout and kidney stones. They encounter issues that other Americans encounter, hypertension, obesity, diabetes, stroke. Cancer became prevalent. And so some studies have found, for example, that Hmong have higher rates of stomach, liver, and cervical cancers compared to the general population, or at least compared to non-Hispanic whites. Nick?
The sudden unexpected
Yeah.
death syndrome.
Yeah.
It's kind of faded. But have they ever, like through research or autopsy or epidemiology studies, have they ever found what they attribute that to?
Yeah. You mean what Hmong attribute that to? Or
anyone who has an explanation. I mean, it
Yeah,
seems to be at a
yeah.
time where the massive migrations were coming to the U.S.
Right.
I'm curious to know what was it.
Right. Not that I know. Anybody hear anything different? John, you want to say?
I haven't heard it in
Yeah.
terms of anything factual, but I have
Yeah.
some hunches about it.
Yeah.
I've been pretty close to some families.
Yeah.
The Hmong, number one, autopsies have been very much not accepted
Mm-hmm.
within the Hmong community for all kinds of reasons, spiritual and other. So in the 70s and 80s, my hunch would be that there was very little autopsy looking at what happened to the body, because you just didn't touch the bodies for autopsies. Seeing some of the other,
Thanks for sharing that.
so in
Yeah.
terms of any research,
Right.
autopsies have not been acceptable
Mm-hmm.
within the Hmong.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like such a drastic change in healthy lifestyle to unhealthy lifestyle. I wonder how much.
Right.
I've heard from a number of families is that was also happening back in Laos and Thailand. Some of that unexpected going to sleep and not waking up, but it was attributed more to spiritual. That their spirit was being taken.
Right.
And
Right.
so
What's-
there too, there was no.
Right. What makes some of these cases mysterious is that at least they have in cases where they do have records, some of these adults who died had no previous medical condition. Now it's of course possible that they could have had heart conditions the night before, or things like of that sort, but they were adults who seemed otherwise pretty healthy, and who just went to sleep and died. And so I've not heard or seen studies that would look at the factors, but it's possible that through their experiences with war, it's possible that their exposure to chemicals during the war may have over time long-time effects. It's not known. So, and then we also see issues like hepatitis B, cardiovascular diseases. So Hmong, coming from a relatively underdeveloped society where, of course, there were diseases, but now in the U.S., the challenge is many of them, both adults and the elderly, face a whole range of complex diseases, and they're not sure what to do with it or how to manage it. So that's a quick summary, for example, of the changes in the health issues from Laos to Thailand to the U.S. Of course, not exhaustive, but a glance at some of the common health issues that they face. So these health issues, of course, face impact mostly the most vulnerable populations, the elderly, seniors, people who are non-English speakers. Not that non-English speakers are more prone to these health conditions, but when they face it, it's harder for them. Low-income people. What are some of the possible contributing factors? Many of us know in the U.S., we live a much more sedentary life compared to others. There's also higher consumptions of fats, sugars, and salts. The the consumption, the ratio of meat to vegetable consumption is probably very high, although we have no actual numbers to back that up yet. There's also very high levels of stress on a daily basis, given our work, given our the other things that happen in our lives, given the control that are placed on us by social institutions. We're also exposed to a whole range of prescribed and non-prescribed pharmaceutical drugs that may impact our physical and mental health. And of course, in the U.S., there's also environmental factors. Hmong adults and the young as well are exposed to secondhand smoke, lead, chemicals in older homes. For Hmong farmers, they're exposed to pesticides. They may not always take the precautionary measures to protect themselves. There's also exposure to pollution in the urban cities, exposure to new germs or diseases in general that Hmong of Laos and Hmong Thailand had never seen. They're too exposed to extreme temperatures. In California, it gets really hot, for example. Wisconsin and Minnesota, as we all know, gets really cold. So there's certainly a whole lot of challenges to overcome in order for them to access health. Let's look at some of them. But first, it's important to keep in mind that Hmong, like many other people, are utilizing Western health care, despite some assumptions that they're not. They use it on a regular basis. They seek advice from medical doctors. They go and get checkups. They seek mental health services. They actually are okay with getting surgeries. They're undergoing dialysis. They're getting cancer treatment. But there are also real fears, fears that go way beyond just their religious or cultural beliefs, fears that are also shared by people in the general population. So some Hmong patients may fear that diagnosis may be wrong, and that could lead to major operations, that could lead to a lot of harm and possibly even death. They sometimes also fear that treatment may proceed without their informed consent. They fear that because they're poor, they're not given as good of health care as other people who are able to afford private health insurance. They fear that prescribed drugs could have very long, serious side effects for mental and physical health. And they fear things like the sterilization of women, especially racial minority women. And finally, they fear that during the encounter with medical doctors, their organs could be forcibly taken or taken without their knowledge or consent. And so these are real fears, as real as you and I say snow or water is real. And again, it's important to keep in mind that it's not unique to Hmong, but it's also fears found in the general population, but especially among underprivileged or disadvantaged communities. So how do we as social workers try to assuage some of these fears, or how do medical doctors assuage some of the fears? I think we can at least begin to take some steps. For example, when working with these populations in our communities, we should try to make our intentions explicit rather than implicit, to the extent that we know what our intentions are while working with them. Make our actions transparent and try to keep our actions consistent with our intentions. Of course, these are easier said than done, but these are things that social workers should try to practice. We should try to recognize that within any social community, there could be immense differences within group differences. And so it's important not to generalize or to stereotype the groups. And we should try to treat persons as individuals while recognizing that our society often does not treat them as individuals. and that because of this type of treatment, there are real consequences for them and for our interactions with them. So trying to assuage some fears. But what more can we do? Well, they also encounter issues, very structural issues, poverty, and poverty, of course, affects their access to health. So people in poverty, as we know, are unable to afford the healthy foods that we may sometimes take for granted. They're unable to afford healthy homes and neighborhoods. They're not able to afford private health insurance or even simple transportation to and from health clinics. But there's also the aspect of language. Language too affects health access. And it's not simply being able to speak the language and then communicate or convey ideas, but knowing the language has a lot to do with our ability to build trust as well with communities. So for Hmong communities and other communities like them, we especially lack medical interpreters and good translators. So throughout the past couple of years, I sometimes work as a part-time translator and interpreter, and I've seen materials that were really badly translated that if and when given to a patient, they probably would not understand what's going on, or they probably not be informed even if they were to give their consent. So having good medical interpreters and translators is at least a good start. That would probably, hopefully, bring about more accurate information. And that's sometimes what patients need. With clear and accurate information, they may be able to make decisions on their own. And patients too, like any of us, want the ability to make independent, informed decisions rather than have these decisions made for them, whether by medical doctors or social workers. And as we know, there's also strong stigmas attached to being poor, being non-English speakers. So recognizing these stigmas is helpful because it's the beginning of a relationship in which social workers can become more culturally sensitive. They can be less ignorant of what the people are going through, and more respectful of others who society may see as different. So people who are not formally educated may sometimes be seen as ignorant or less knowledgeable than the average American person. They may sometimes be seen as simply superstitious, as opposed to being logical or scientific, or stubborn, or mentally ill, or deviant in all sorts of ways. But as part of our job as social workers is to recognize that these stigmas exist, and to recognize that individuals too, despite being in poverty, despite being non-English native speakers, have intelligence, they have logical ways of thinking, they have real fears just like all of us, and that they're not necessarily mentally ill or deviant just simply because they're poor or they don't speak English well. One of the large issue too, and I think of the book, The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down, that some of you may have read. That book, I think, partly makes the argument for what the author calls a cultural clash situation, where things come about because of the differences, the supposedly different cultures. So Hmong culture, or seen as a putatively isolated, monolithic culture as opposed to Western culture. I want to think that many times problems arise not because of cultural difference, but because of difference in power instead. The power between state agencies and ordinary citizens, for example, is clear to us, and the power differences between medical doctors and patients in general is there. There's also a difference in terms of power between experts and non-experts, for example. So many times it's not about cultural difference. It's not cultural difference that leads to misunderstandings or problems. It's the difference in power. And unless and until we recognize that issue, some things cannot be resolved. So folks who have less power, for example, are seen as having non-scientific knowledge, where they're treated with less respect, etc. And that leads to perhaps non-compliance behavior. But if we were able to somehow magically break down this power differential, I think we would have less problems between patients seeking care and medical doctors trying to implement treatment for them. So, so once again, books like The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down are helpful depending on how we teach them in classes, but they're not always helpful if we take it at face value for the types of culture, Hmong culture knowledge or Hmong history that the book tries to, but unsuccessfully, I think, in my view, do at the end. So I'll leave you with that. And any questions? Do we still have some time, or are we out of time? Okay. Yeah. Yes, Nick.
In your research, are there communities, programs, something along those lines that you would identify as this is a good practice, this is a best practice model with this particular issue that we might want to look at for ideas?
Yeah. It will probably depend on what the issues are, but I think it's always a good idea for social workers, for example, to be in the community with people who live in the community for an extended period of time to begin to identify what are some of the health issues. And so going out to the community is at least a start. Working with community organizations may be another type of thing we can do. Community organizations whose aims are to better the community rather than to simply provide service but not follow up with them. But depending on what the issues are, there could be some good practice, I think. But we would first identify what the people consider to be the health issues or social issues, and then ask them for their involvement in helping to identify what the possible solutions may be. Would be a kind of practice, I think, that we could use. Yeah. Yes, go ahead.
I'm just curious, do you feel, or have you found in your research that there's a change, maybe with the younger generations, of the community structure, or is it maintaining itself, at least in Wisconsin?
Yeah. Do you mean that the youth, are they still behaving in similar ways to what the elders are behaving, or?
Well, like as far as, assimilation.
Sure.
Or whatever, is there, in ways that, I guess, Westerners can try to identify or communicate better. I'm just thinking, for example, our students that I've talked to, the Hmong students are, I would say, are I don't know if that's the right word, more traditional, I guess. Whereas my daughter, when she was in high school, the Hmong students there were adopting more of the, for example, like hip-hop culture or something like that. Sense of
Yeah. It depends too. I mean, segments of the youth population have adopted some pop culture, for example, or forms of that. So I think it's helpful sometimes to talk about subcultures. Not all youth are assimilating at the same rate. There's some, almost at any instant or location, there's a degree of assimilation that has occurred, especially among the youth. But the elders too have assimilated. to some degree. They've let go of some previous beliefs, they let go of certain practices, in part because they could no longer practice them, or the legal policies in their local communities no longer allow them to. So among both the youth and the elder, there's a degree of assimilation. The youth, we could say, have assimilated more, not surprising, than the elders, but it's hard to say simply what the youth are assimilating to and whether they are assimilating in that fashion. Yeah.
I guess I'm wondering also, is assimilation, is that what we want? Or what you want? Or,
Yeah, that's a great question. Assimilating to what, right? If assimilation means losing your language, is that a good thing? Maybe not, according to the research and according to what our observations. It may not be a good thing to just simply lose your heritage language, because you lose not simply language, but your ability to relate to the ethnic group or to your elders. How about assimilating to assimilation in terms of spatial assimilation, becoming more integrated in the communities rather than isolated? That may or may not be a good thing depending on X, Y, and Z. We could talk about spatial assimilation, about economic assimilation, right? If you are able to acquire the cultural capital that you need in order to get into certain types of labor market, that may be a good thing. It's a type of assimilation. So it depends. Not all assimilation are bad, I think, but not assimilation in general is neither good or bad depending on what the issues are. Yeah. Joe?
Yeah, thanks. Sorry for...
No, not at all. No.
I'm glad I was able to catch the hand.
Thanks.
I think it was your previous slide, or maybe the slide before that.
Yeah.
You kind of showed, made reference to the dichotomy between kind of like scientific knowledge versus folk knowledge, I guess. And that's something that I'm interested in.
Yeah.
And I wondered, I'm just kind of interested in what is the state of, I guess, research, but also practice in terms of what's offered out there. In terms of, are there health services and addiction health services or mental health services that are culturally appropriate in the sense that they actually take into consideration folk knowledge or indigenous knowledge, rather than just scientific Western knowledge.
Right,
What
right,
should we do?
right. You probably know a lot more about the substance abuse literature than I do, so I don't know much about that. But I do know, in general, places like Merced, California, for example, have recently tried to incorporate Hmong shaman practices, allowing shamans to go into hospitals to perform certain rituals. Now, if we call that the integration of Western thinking and folk thinking, then that's one example. But I still get the sense that folk knowledge is still not treated on par with medical Western knowledge or scientific knowledge. They're there in order to make it look good sometimes. The intention is certainly a good intention. They're there, so they're providing space for shamans to come to provide certain services that function as social support to patients, and that's a good thing. I think most of us would agree. But I get the sense that in general, the knowledge that shamans hold are still seen as superstitious, for example, compared to the knowledge that medical doctors hold of certain health conditions. So that's what I mean when I say that they're still not on par, even though there's some degree of incorporating or being more inclusive of folk communities or folk thinking. Others want to add or have seen? Yeah, John.
Just a few direct experiences being in emergency rooms or in hospitals with a dying goes beyond what we would normally think as being good, healthy practice. So there's been accommodation and I think permission in a number of cases.
There's certainly some accommodation over the years. to what extent this means that the beliefs of the folk communities are accepted as on par with scientific belief, that's a different question. Yeah. 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 Other types of questions, comments? Well, thank you then. Thank you then. Appreciate it.